Youri is recording.
Oh, okay, you got it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And boy, are we joined by a truth-teller and myth-buster today. We are joined by Miko Peled. Miko is an author, a speaker. He's an Israeli journalist and activist, a frequent contributor to Mintpress. Folks who watch the show are familiar with it because we've had Whitney Webb on before, we've had Rick Sterling on before, and we've also had the editor-in-chief of Mintpress, Manar Adley. And yes, on this edition of 1+1, we're going to be talking about all things Israel. So first of all, Mr. Peled, thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure, it's a pleasure.
And it's an honor, and yeah, it's an honor to have you on. And yeah, let's get to it. And yeah, let's get to it. All right. So the first question I actually wanted to ask you, Mr. Peled, is can you talk to us briefly about the coronavirus crisis that and its impact on Israel, how Israel is coping with it or not coping with it? I'm just out of curiosity before we get into all of the issues about Palestine and Israel's imperialist policies outside of Palestine.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for the opportunity to chat.
It's an honor. It's an honor.
So, I don't know if you or the people listening are aware, but since March, or rather since last November, there have been weekly protests against the government in Israel on a regular basis by Israelis. Granted, these are mostly, upper middle class Ashkenazi Israelis, but kind of wealthy people. And then since March, because of the mismanagement, the really catastrophic mismanagement of the coronavirus by the government and the dysfunction of the government, these protests have really been amplified. And there are thousands in the streets every week in front of the Prime Minister's residence and across the country, protesting against Netanyahu and against his government, demanding, number one, that he resign because he's been indicted, number two, that he resign because of the mismanagement. And really,
because Netanyahu, sorry to interrupt, because Netanyahu has been engulfed in a series of corruption, bribery scandals, and for a long period of time, it looked as if he was going to, he had a very highly contested election, and twice they weren't even able to form a government. But then they were able to form a government because of this coronavirus crisis. But since then, the protests in Israel have just been snowballing into a huge avalanche effect. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I mean he knows how to hold on to power. He's the best. I like to say he's the best horse trader there, and so he knows how to hold on to power. He knows how to create the coalition. That's why he's been prime minister for over 10 years, even though he's lost the elections a couple of times and still remain, within that decade. But anyway, these protests have been quite serious. Like I said, thousands of people showing up every week in Jerusalem in front of the prime minister's residence and other places. But when you come to think of it, the entire country is really, the healthcare system is completely collapsing, and it's been collapsing for many years now. It's in a state of collapse because of mismanagement, because Netanyahu is inept, because he has governments of not of professionals, but his governments are always lackeys, people that are willing to support his corruption, willing to support his corrupt ways as a politician. He's like a mafia boss. So the functioning of the government is not what's his interest. His interest is to remain in power. So the healthcare system is collapsing. The education system is collapsing. The judicial system is collapsing. The police force has been in a state of collapse for a very long time. The Israeli police force, which is a national force. So in other words, when you look at what's happening now in light of the coronavirus and the spread of COVID, it's not surprising that things are falling apart. And they were up to just maybe less than a month ago, 10,000 new cases a day. They had to close the airports, and now they're closing again, and they're shutting down again because things are so severe, and they're just incapable of managing because they're incompetent. It's an incompetent fascist government. So that's the reality on the Israeli side. Now, the impact on the Palestinians is obvious because the Palestinian citizens of Israel make up the majority of the poor people. They have no resources.
And you're talking about Palestinians both in the occupied territories, but also the ones that work as cheap labor and second-class citizens in Tel Aviv.
I'm talking about Palestinians who are actually citizens of the state of Israel, Palestinians who live within what used to be called Israel proper, or the Green Line. So that's a community of about 2 million people, and they make up the majority of the poor among Israeli citizens. The Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have no citizenship. These have kind of a quasi-Israeli citizenship. So they're in, their lands have been taken. They're not permitted to build, so they live in very crowded conditions. They have no access to water. They have no access to healthcare in many cases, or if they do have access to healthcare, they're always pushed to the end of the line. So they're the last ones to receive healthcare. The situation with kids going to school is the most severe because the information is given in Hebrew. Palestinians speak mostly Arabic, predominantly Arabic. So the impact of this really catastrophe on Palestinian citizens of Israel has been severe because, again, they are the most vulnerable communities that are governed, particularly, like I said, what they used to call Israel proper, which are the citizens of the state of Israel. So that's the reality.
And then a follow-up question to that. You talked about how the Israeli socioeconomic system, from the education system, from healthcare, from even the police force, has all been collapsing for decades. And is that because of all of the neoliberalism and shock doctrine and corporate-friendly policies that seems that the whole world has been adopting, and has Israel also been doing the same thing, whether it's Likud in power or Labor in power, and that's why COVID has just really punched Israeli society like a wrecking ball, kind of similar to how the U.S. doesn't have a proper healthcare system. The Brits have privatized their healthcare system, so COVID, of course, has impacted them very harshly. Is a similar thing in Israel?
Well, I think COVID exposed it. It's like I said, it was already in a state of collapse, partly because of the reasons that you mentioned, and also because when you have a corrupt, racist regime, then the systems collapse because they put all the resources into maintaining the racism, maintaining the fascist regime. That's the only thing they care about, particularly with this prime minister. So everything has been collapsing and nobody cares as long as the upper middle class, kind of white privileged people are happy. Nobody cares about anything else. And when they do protest, as they are doing now, nobody really cares because they know they're not going to do anything and they really don't have that much political power. So that's the reality. And the state of Israel, has been in a state of collapse for a very long time. It's being held. It's being held by a thread. And I don't think it's going to take much to bring its total collapse, quite frankly.
When I got the chance to visit Israel, because I have a lot of friends from Israel. My brother's friend of his was getting married, and we went. So we went to Israel, and I noticed, and for me, I was quite shocked how visible the gap between rich and poor is in Israel. And it like there seemed to be a lot of abandoned buildings, and the powers to be think that, okay, when there's poverty and stuff like that, when the cost of living goes up, all we need to do is just gentrify it and make it more amiable to the super rich. Has that been going on a lot in Israel?
Yeah, that's been the trend. Again, this has been the trend all along. People forget sometimes the state of Israel is it's really not a legitimate state, but it's not a state that has any roots in where it exists. So the only way for it to exist is like this. It's a state that that was built very rapidly on the ashes of another country that they took over and a people that they forcibly expelled. So they were able to become, the state was able to function very quickly because of the wealth that the Palestinians left. The Palestinian says that Israel, they always say the Zionists took Palestine furnished. They say in Arabic. They took it, furnished. I mean, they took everything that was there, and that is why it was able to function, and it had, a lot of riches that it stole, that it took. So everything was built on that, on taking from those who were kicked out, giving it to others, and then building on that. So of course there's no foundation, there's no roots, and so that's exactly the way it is. And this again goes back to the I think the reason why we can expect to see more and more decline, or the more rapid decline of this artificial state, which is the state of Israel. And that, I think, in the long run is going to be good for bringing about a free Palestine.
All righty, and then isn't though the tragedy with I mean I think it's great to see people protesting against Netanyahu, but isn't the tragedy though with the protests against Netanyahu is that it's very similar to the protests about that happened a couple of years ago. When there was a global financial crisis, there were many Israelis protesting against the cost of living and the inability to have affordable apartments, affordable affordable everything. But it was mainly on housing. Yeah. But the tragedy, it wasn't the tragedy of that. Was that nobody wanted to connect it to Israel's Israel's militarism overseas, be it Iraq, and you've mentioned Palestine, which we're definitely going to get into. But that nobody wants to say, well, the reason why things are going to shit is because we're spending way too much money on military. Kind of like how in the U.S. people protest a lot about how there's way too much money that goes into the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, it's going to end the exact same way, because these are people that, it's like they got to go out and they got to protest and then they go home and everything's fine. They're not missing anything. They're not hungry. They don't have any, you know what I mean? In other words, they're not fighting for their life. They're fighting so they can go back and say, yes, we stood up and we told Netanyahu, and it's meaningless. They have first of all, he doesn't care, because he knows that he's very secure. He's very safe with the coalition that he's established. The extreme right-wing bloc supports him 100%, 110%. So he's secure in that regard. And these are not people that are going to actually do anything. So
you're talking about the protesters.
Yeah, about the protests. I wrote about this actually in Mintpress a couple of weeks ago. These are protests that are going to lead to nothing. They don't impact him. He doesn't really care about them. If anything, it props him up, because he can claim to be a real, open-minded, democratic. He's letting these people protest. So yeah, this is going to lead to nothing.
And do you think the moment another false flag occurs, or if another, or when the Palestinians show the first sight of resistance again, either protesting peacefully or shooting a homemade rocket, the moment another war happens and Israel flattens Gaza and the West Bank, all of those people who have been protesting against Prime Minister Netanyahu are going to unanimously support him again?
Of course, absolutely, without any doubt. Not that this stuff ever stops. I mean, the ongoing killing, arresting, and so forth of Palestinians and the Palestinian resistance never really stops. But the attention shifts now to something else, and then you're right. As soon as there's like a security threat, everybody's going to back him up, and things are going to go back to the way they were. Absolutely, yeah.
Then now onto these three so onto these three historical questions before I ask to you, but before we get into sort of the anatomy of the state of Israel, which you already alluded to, now previous guests of of mine, I think actually most of my guests on the show are all very critical of Israel, and they all go into, and they're also very critical against how Israel was founded upon. But I don't want to get into that because I'm sure everybody already knows that, and anyone who's familiar with your work knows that you're very critical of the founding of Israel, that it was not this peaceful country that was founded upon, that the Palestinians did not want to negotiate with, that it was founded as a settler colonial society or an apartheid regime, as some people would say. So that being said, let me actually present the Israeli point of view, and you can you can challenge it, which is the 1967 war, which really entrenched the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and also stole land from Syria, the Golan Heights. Do you think don't you think the fact that that there was this surprise attack by, if I'm not mistaken, my countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and that the fact that there was this surprise attack on Israel, that it backfired completely, because Israel entrenched, they made their occupation of Palestine even stronger. They took the Golan Heights. And then Israel got to say to the whole world, "See, we are surrounded by hostile."
There was no surprise attack against Israel. There was no surprise attack. Israel initiated the war. Israel attacked. There was.
Oh, wait a minute. Actually, am I actually? I think I might be mistaking the '67 war for the 4-day war then, or.
You're talking about, Yom Kippur War, the 1973 war. There was a surprise attack against Israel. There was.
Okay.
But in 1967, Israel initiated the war, initiated the attack, and that's when they took the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights and so on. The argument on the other side is that somehow Israel had no choice, which is just complete nonsense. Of course, this was a war that was well planned years in advance. Taking the Golan Heights and taking the West Bank these were plans that sat in a drawer in the Israeli army headquarters for a very long time. I quote in my book, in the General's Son, my father is a young officer in the 1950s talking about the military expecting the order to come from the government to take the West Bank. Already back in the 50s, the Golan Heights was something that the state of Israel had wanted also for a very, very long time. So this was just an opportunity that the military was strong enough to create enough political pressure and so on, in order to initiate this land grab, this massive assault, unprovoked and unjustified assault on Arab countries, in order to steal the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights from the Syrians, and also the Sinai Peninsula, which, about a decade later, they returned to Egypt as part of a peace, so-called peace agreement. But this is all mythology. I mean, the justifying Israel's land grab, justifying Israel's aggression throughout its history, throughout the 72-year history against Palestinians, against other Arabs, is part of the propaganda. I mean, there is no justification to Israeli brutality other than its desire to maintain its status as the toughest, meanest bully in the region, and to take whatever it wants, whenever it wants it, and maintain its military presence and its military force and its military kind of character, so as to intimidate anybody from nobody would dare challenge them because they're intimidated. But that's what it's all about. It has nothing to do with any kind of existential threat or anything like that.
So in a follow-up question on that, so when the surprise attack did happen, that Syria, Egypt, and its allies waged, and that's the Yom Kippur War, right?
Yeah, that's in 1973, the October 6th.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe I even forgot that with all the years I've been studying Israel. Okay, so when that attack did happen, that was more or less the Middle East had a right to sort of get back those lands that Israel took during '67, but also to defend the nationhood of Palestine, because the UN simply was not doing anything to find a just.
This had nothing to do. The 1973 war had nothing to do with Palestinians or with Palestine. I mean, the Egyptians and the Syrians decided they're going to take their land back because Israel was obviously not going to negotiate and was not willing. I mean, Egypt had a relatively new president in Anwar Sadat. He offered the Israelis a peace agreement in return for the return of the Sinai. Israel didn't even respond. So, a year later, or about a year and a half later, after he made the initial contact to try to negotiate a peace agreement, they just attacked, and it was a very successful attack because Israel was still basking in the glow of its victory of 1967, and the military was ill prepared. The government was inept again, and so forth. And really, Israel doesn't know what to do, is incapable of defending itself against a well-organized, well-disciplined attack. It always attacked either armies that were disorganized, ill-equipped, ill-prepared, or, in the case of the Palestinians, a nation that never had an army. So in that, and then it can claim these enormous victories, of course, because there was no enemy, there was nobody to challenge them. In 1973, they were seriously challenged by two very well-disciplined, well-prepared, well-armed armies. And in case of the Syrians in the Golan Heights, they almost took the entire Golan Heights back because Israel assumed that the Arabs are so scared of the Israeli might that they would never attack. Well, they did, and the Syrian army stopped because they were afraid they were being driven into an ambush. They could not imagine the Israeli army was so ill prepared. The Egyptians moved forward for as long as they wanted to, and then they stopped because they had enough bargaining chips to negotiate, and also they completely demolished what defenses the Israeli military had on the Suez Canal, which is where the border was after when Israel took Sinai. So I mean, it worked well for this. It could have been better for the Syrians had they not stopped. They could have had the Golan Heights back, but basically, it had nothing to do with the Palestinians. It had to do with the Syrians and the Egyptians asserting their right to take their land back, the land that was taken.
Wow, thank you so much for clarifying that because even when I was taught by the best history, and even with all of the documentaries I watch, which are and all of them are very critical of Israel, they still kind of fall into this was a surprise attack on behalf of the Palestinians, yeah. but Israel somehow managed to beat the hostile neighbors more or less.
They did eventually beat them, but they did eventually turn things around militarily. But this was a massive blow, military blow and political blow for Israel. Absolutely.
Then talk to us briefly about Lebanon. Then, now Lebanon is a whole nother can of worms, which I don't want to get into. But Lebanon had a very bitter sectarian civil war. Somehow Palestine managed to get sort of, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict kind of bled into that civil war. You yourself are a veteran of when Israel invaded Lebanon. Now, can you sort of debunk some of the propaganda that's behind that? Because Israelis would say, because I'm sure Israelis would say to you, Mr. Peled, and to like-minded folks, that Israel only invaded Lebanon because the Palestinians kept attacking from Lebanon, and if the Lebanese state wasn't going to make those refugees and the PLO stop attacking us and Hezbollah, therefore we had to invade in the 1980s.
Well, first of all, there was no Hezbollah then. The reason the Hezbollah exists is the response to the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon that began then. So okay. Hezbollah did not exist in those days. And Hezbollah eventually is the reason they managed to get the Israeli army out of Lebanon. I mean, is the thanks to the Hezbollah and their ability to fight and defeat the Israeli army, the southern Lebanon is free of Israeli forces today.
During the 80s.
Well, yes, I mean, the invasion was in 1982, but I'm saying 20 years later, they kicked Israel out, and it was Hezbollah's ability. And then again, during several incursions by Israel, Hezbollah managed to keep the Israeli military out of Lebanon. But that's much, much later. To begin with, yes, I mean, Lebanon has a huge population of Palestinian refugees. And so it's not like this came out of nowhere. These refugees have a right to resist, they have a right to fight, they have a right to return to their homes and their land and be paid restitution and compensation for what was taken from them. And the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Movement, was headquartered in Beirut, in Lebanon, during those, for decades. And they would attack from there. Naturally, that's where they attacked from. And eventually Israel would go in, had all these incursions, and they would come out. The incursions in and out. And eventually they decided to go in, not only in order to fight the Palestinians, but also they were hoping to create a favorable right-wing Christian government, to force a right-wing Christian government in Lebanon that would be favorable to Israel. And of course, they tried that, and it was catastrophic in the end for both the Palestinians and the Lebanese. Wow. But everything begins as there is, any justification to Israeli actions, Israeli military actions, is always preceded by this argument that somehow, Palestinians are attacking Israel and Palestinians are involved in terrorism against Israel. Well, we need to start the conversation one step before that, because the first of all, there's no such thing as Palestinian terrorism. Palestinian resistance is a legitimate resistance against an occupying state, an occupying army, a state that has been engaged in ethnic cleansing and genocide for almost 100 years. So we have to put that in perspective. It's not Palestinian terrorism that's causing the violence. It's Israel causing the violence, Palestinians responding, but people choose to only start the conversation from the place where Palestinians respond, as little as it is. I mean, Palestinians have never had a military force, so their military responses are completely ineffective. I mean, here and there, they've had maybe an operation where they hijacked a plane or kidnapped this, but really, by and large, there's never been a Palestinian military, which is why there's never been a Palestinian military success. So that is where the conversation needs to start. Why are Palestinians in refugee camps? Why do Palestinians need to resort to resistance? Why are Palestinians being placed in this position where they have to resist? And how is it that people think that the Palestinian resistance is not justified? How can anybody look at the reality in Palestine over the last 100 years and criticize the Palestinians for fighting for their own rights, their own liberty, their own land, rather than, rather than criticizing Israel for its aggression? That's really where the conversation needs to start.
And then one final question on Lebanon before we get into those issues you just raised. But don't you think that Israel, and again, this is just me being objective, and I'm not even disagreeing with a lot of the arguments you're making, but don't you think, fast forward to the last, conflicts that happened between Israel and Lebanon, but not even Lebanon per se, but more Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah, kidnapped this soldier from Israel, which later, was murdered. Don't you think that the fact that Hezbollah, did that to Israel, that they kind of provoked Israel to have this this violent response back into Lebanon, in which many Lebanese were, I hate to use the term, but collateral damage?
No. First of all, soldiers are not kidnapped. Soldiers are not children. And they are occupation soldiers, and they are occupying land that they should not be in. So when you're a soldier in an occupied territory, you're fair game. If you don't want to be fair game, you should not be wearing uniform, carrying a gun, and going into somebody else's territory. Then Israel, but Israel always finds some little thing to say, aha, see, now we're justified. In this last incursion you talked about, Israel created over 1 million refugees in southern Lebanon, total destruction.
And I think this was back in 2006, right?
Right, and terrible massacres. I mean, it was horrible. This is from the air. The Israeli ground forces. Israel sent its finest ground forces, all of its commandos in, and they were all chased away by Hezbollah, running with their tails between their legs back home to mommy, because they could not face the well-organized, well-disciplined, motivated military force of Hezbollah. That's the reality. And so, but from the air, because Israel's got the technology, Israel's got the hardware, they can create, complete destruction, and they did. But to justify that, again, we're always starting the conversation from the wrong place. We did start the conversation just a little bit before that. Why are Israeli soldiers roaming around in Palestinian territory. It reminds me of this story. I had this ridiculous argument, this idea that a soldier is kidnapped. A soldier is not kidnapped. There was a case where Israel claimed that soldiers entered Ramallah by mistake. How do you enter a city, a big city, Palestinian city, with signs all over it and checkpoints by mistake? You know what I mean? This doesn't happen. A soldier with a uniform and a gun is a soldier in a uniform and a gun, and they're meant to do bad things. So if they're in territory that belongs to somebody else, they should expect to be attacked. They should expect not to be welcomed with roses. I go to Ramallah all the time. I'm never attacked by anyone. Okay, so I mean, this is something we need to put in perspective. This very strange phrase of a soldier being kidnapped. A soldier is not a kid.
And then one last question about Lebanon then, and actually next time I invite you back on the show, we're going to dedicate a whole program to Israel and Lebanon because I'm learning so much. But one last question about Israel and Lebanon. During the Lebanese Civil War, was Israel way before the invasion where they were attacking Palestinians that they claimed that they were retaliating against Palestinian attacks? Was Israel always, before the Sabra and Shatila massacre, supporting the Christian right-wing factions of the Lebanese Civil War?
Oh, absolutely, of course. Israel always backed them. Israel was always hoping to see a good right-wing, non-democratic Christian state in Lebanon that it could work with. That was always Israel's attempt, and that would allow it to go in and, all these incursions in the 60s and 70s into Lebanon to assassinate Palestinian writers, Palestinian political active figures, all these operations, so-called operations, where Israel would go in and murder people in their beds. They would have loved to have a government that would have made it. Not that it was difficult for Israel to do, but they would have loved to have a government that was, really in their pockets. So yes, they did all along, of course.
And Israel currently would like to see the corrupt Saudi-backed Hariri oligarch's son remain in power, right?
Israel is happy to see any situation that allows for, number one, an imbalance in power, and number two, instability. As long as there's instability in the Arab world, Israel is happy because, number one, it makes it easier for it to control things, and number two, it makes it look good. So wherever there's instability, Israel is very, very happy. A stable Lebanon is something Israel does not want. Any stable Arab regime, Arab state, and God forbid a democratic one, is something Israel will fight as much as it can. So yeah, it's always happy to see instability.
And I had Rick Sterling, who's another contributor to Mintpress News, on the show. We mainly discuss about Syria, and Rick was saying to me that Israel is a partner in crime to the Western Gulf-backed war in Syria. Israel also supported the overthrow of Gaddafi, and Netanyahu also publicly supported the Iraq war, even when there were Israelis protesting in the streets against that impending invasion. So it's a safe, and I think Israel also supported the coup in Ukraine that saw rival oligarchs and neo-Nazis, which hates the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian Russians. And Israel, I think, also supports Bolsonaro and also the war for oil in Venezuela, right?
Well, I don't have proof at my disposal, but Israel will support anything that will benefit its own narrow interests. So any government that would challenge its brutality, challenge the apartheid regime, challenge its hegemony in the region, Israel will go against whichever way it can, and any government that will support it and buy weapons from it, they will support. So I mean, they've been, if you go back, going back to the 1960s, Israel supported the regime of Mobutu in the Congo. The democratically elected Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in a coalition between the Belgians and the Americans, and immediately the Israeli army was there training the Congolese, the new dictator Mobutu. My father, in uniform as a general, would go to the Congo and come back, regularly to meet and be part of that. So, I mean, Israel has been, and they trained Idi Amin in Uganda. I mean, Israel has trained dictators throughout the world and dark regimes throughout the world, and it still does, either because it helps them with influence and with political influence, or in order to sell weapons, or both. So that's what Israel is. It's always been a force of a negative force in the region and beyond the region.
Absolutely. And the Israeli state, you mentioned Congo, also supports Paul Kagame, who's actually the real perpetrator of the slaughter in Rwanda and the massive slaughter and stealing of economic resources in Congo right now. Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned that. So is Israel's foreign policy, will it basically overthrow any government and supports American, Anglo-Canadian imperialism, even if the country just mentions diplomatically that they support the rights of Palestinians, or is it something deeper than that, and that Israel just wants to be a partner in crime to Western imperialism because it benefits the oligarchs? Or
who knows? I think it's a who knows? Basically, the interests, when the interests cross over, then Israel is always happy to be there.
Wow, fascinating. And that leads to that leads to an article that you just that you just did about Jeremy Corbyn. When I first met you, I met you at a Palestine festival a few years ago, where John Pilger was also speaking, Ilan Pape, Asa Winstanley, and so forth. The second time I met you was when I was a reporter for Black Agenda Reports, covering the Labor Party conference and the humongous, dare I say, civil war that was happening between the pro-Zionists and the Jewish anti-Zionists and Palestine solidarity activists, and there's no doubt that Israel was behind the coup against Jeremy Corbyn and the smear campaign against him, and the People Power movement and the Palestine Solidarity movement that was behind him. But that being said, there still seems to be this awful trend that happens of the whole people who are progressive on everything except Palestine. And I wanted you to reflect on the fact that while it's infuriating what happened to Jeremy Corbyn and what happened to so many of his supporters, so many of them who were slandered as anti-Semites when they were Jewish, and others who just were legitimately criticizing the ideology of Zionism and Israel's human rights abuses. However, Jeremy Corbyn and his entire leadership team threw a lot of those supporters under the bus when they said there's an anti-Semitism crisis. We're dealing with it. So, isn't the big obstacle the reason why we still have a hard time waging justice for Palestine is because people still think that that Palestinian lives are that expendable, and there still is that whole issue of progressive on everything except Palestine, because you had Navarra Media and you had many token lefties and pseudo leftists who were just ready to say, yes, there's an anti-Semitism crisis, we're dealing with it, even though they knew full well that they were slandering Jewish anti-Zionists. Your reflections on that?
I think first of all, Jeremy Corbyn made a huge strategic mistake when he chose to capitulate rather than fight the accusations and support people like Tony Greenstein and Chris Williamson and all these other wonderful, Ken Livingston, all these
Jackie
pillars.
Walker, and I've had both Chris and Jackie on my show.
And these are pillars of the labor movement. These are pillars of the Labor Party. These are great socialists, people who don't have a racist cell in their body. And Jeremy Corbyn, rather than stand up and fight and really when you're faced with a bully the more you back up, the more fierce they become. The only way to stand up to a bully is to stand up and say stop, and then they back off. And that's typically what Israel does. When we look at the times or situations where Israel was actually challenged, they back off because they're scared, because they don't really have the power that they claim to have. But the more you retreat, the more you admit, the more you apologize, the stronger they become. And that's exactly what happened, to the point where they were able to actually get the Labour Party to suspend Jeremy Corbyn, you know. But of course, if they did this to Ken Livingstone, who was a massive, huge pillar, and George Galloway, others that were important figures in labor. So that's one thing. The other thing is, these so-called progressives, except for Palestine, are not really progressive, because at the end of the day, they're supporting racism and they're supporting violence, and they're always supporting somebody who supports that violence. They're always supporting somebody in the country in which they live that supports the racist regime in Palestine, that supports Zionism. So they're really not progressive at all. In the US, you've got the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which pretends to be a civil rights organization. It's a racist, terror-supporting, monstrous organization it calls itself the Anti-Defamation League, but it is actually
they engage in a lot of defamation slander.
Is all they do. Defamation is all they do, But that's a very typical kind of way of bullies to act. They project what they do on others. So they claim that they are the victims. Now, what Israel has done, and the Zionists have done for Israel, I should say, is create this new definition of an anti-Semitism. So it took all the things that Israel is guilty of and placed it on the column of under the definition of anti-Semitism. If you say all of these things, any of these things, that's anti-Semitism. So you can't say anything about Israel, because it's all anti-Semitism. Anyone who accepts that is now put in a position where they can't say anything about Israel, because anything you say, you are anti-Semitic. Well, the Labour Party accepted it, but they had Jeremy Corbyn, who was still supported the Palestinian rights. So you can't do both. So in a way, getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn and all these other wonderful people was the only option, because as soon as they accepted what's called the IHRA definition, it's done. Once you accepted it, you can't criticize Israel, so you have to get rid of everybody else, because that is anti-Semitism. So they recreated the idea of what anti-Semitism is through this new definition, and now it places Israel in a place where it can say, look, we're just defending ourselves against racism. We're just defending ourselves against anti-Semitism, because the Palestinians must be anti-Semitic. People like you and I have to be anti-Semitic. Certainly Jeremy Corbyn and people like him are anti-Semitic, and that's it, problem solved. Why do you accept this new definition? Who the hell is IHRA to create new definitions, and why should the Labour Party, and by the way, the Labour Party is not the only one, here in the United States, all over Europe, both governmental and non-governmental organizations are accepting this new definition. Why? Are they out of their minds? It's basically wrapping this rope around their necks so that Israel can just hang them, and that's exactly what they've been doing. They willingly put the noose across on their neck and allowed Israel to just pull, and that's exactly what happened to the Labour Party. And we see this happening in other places too. So this is how this is working. So these progressives, except for Palestine, are not progressives. No, they're absolutely not progressives, because you cannot be progressive and support racism and violence. You have to choose.
And yet, Jeremy Corbyn, who had one of the best CVs in the British Parliament, being not just a social justice warrior at home, but an anti-imperialist abroad, and including Palestine, but he dug his own grave. He, John McDonnell, his terrible advisors and others, all dug their own graves. So therefore, I mean, as much as it's sad what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, he didn't defend all of his. He didn't even defend his own friends when they were being slandered. So why should we extend solidarity back to him then?
I mean, 2017, I think the first time I went to a Labour Party conference, and I met Chris Williamson for the first time, and everybody I knew kind of around Labour was expecting that Chris Williamson would be the next would be Jeremy Corbyn's deputy leader, and that would have been wonderful. Of course, this whole anti-Semitism came about, and Jeremy Corbyn, rather than arm himself with the good advice of good people who were true to him and true to the cause, he let them, he threw them under the bus. And naturally, what happened now to him is the direct consequence of his own actions. There's no question about that.
And but then
In
this
fact,
gets.
I'm doing a panel with Chris Williamson and Tony Greenstein and Asa Winstanley in a couple of next week, next Monday to discuss all this again. You know, it's ridiculous.
But this then gets into this question. But then this gets into this question then, Mr. Peled, which is, how difficult then is it if you're an Israeli living in Israel to speak out? Because I imagine you probably get, the equivalent of what happens in the Catholic Church excommunicated. And then what advice would you give to other Jewish people outside of Israel, or even those within Israel, who do want to speak out, but rightly so, they're afraid if they are speaked out that they're practically going to be shunned from their entire community? And we've even seen, going back to the Labour Party, all of these Jewish anti-Zionists were basically kind of excommunicated from their own community and called anti-Semites before the entire world. With the board of deputy of Jews, and even people who probably don't know diddly squat about Judaism saying, yep, they are an anti-Semite because of, yada yada.
It's a small price to pay. When you're white and privileged, it's a small price to pay to do the right thing. So the racists call you, don't like you anymore. The people who are within your so-called community don't want to be your friends anymore. Well, there's no loss. I don't feel any sense of loss that certain Israelis don't want to talk to me or call me names. I mean, it's a small price to pay. It means nothing to me. I lose nothing. I don't miss a meal because of it or a good night's sleep. So when you're privileged and you have a conscience, then there's sometimes the conscience and the privilege are at odds, and you've got to decide where you stand. You stand with the privilege or you stand with your conscience. I personally could not in good conscience but reject Zionism and the state of Israel. Can't do it. So does it hurt my privilege? At the end of the day, not so much. Not so much. I probably made more friends since I've done this than I've lost friends. You know what I mean? So this whole argument that somehow it's justified because your own community might not like you anymore. What does your community even mean? I mean, what does that mean? Zionists are my community just because we have the same skin color or we were born with an Israeli citizenship? I mean, that's nonsense. These are not my community anyway. These are not my, you know what I mean? They say, oh, you're a traitor. You can't be a traitor to something you don't believe in. You know what I mean? You can't be a traitor to something that you're against, inherently should be against to begin with. So that's again, when you're in a place of privilege, you should use your privilege to do good things. You should do your privilege and let your conscience take over, and then you can utilize the privilege to do the right thing. That's my take on it. So I don't think there's a cost here that is prohibitive. I think it's a cost that's a small price to pay in order to do the right thing.
Then one last question that I wanted to ask you then is that being said, I think I think what you're basically saying to people is, guys, stop allowing stop allowing evil to intimidate you and just speak out. The more people speak out, the more the dominoes will fall, just like, when you're speaking out against racism against black people and racism against indigenous people, right?
Yes, exactly. That's absolutely what I'm saying. The more, look, this is all a question of whether it's like you say, whether you allow it to happen or not. Are you going to allow it to happen or not? Are you going to use your privilege to stop it or not? Can you imagine if Jeremy Corbyn stood up and said, no, this whole IHRA thing is nonsense. We are not going to accept it, and use his power. He brought the Labour Party to numbers in terms of membership that were unprecedented. And this allowed for, a lot of economic benefit because people pay their dues. And suddenly the Labour Party was, had money in the bank, and they didn't have, it just created a whole new system, a whole new set of opportunities for the UK Labour Party. And he could have stood up and said, excuse me, these are my people, and we're going to resist this, and we're going to fight this, and we're not going to let you get away with it because we know that we are not racist. We know that supporting Palestine is not anti-Semitism. Quite the opposite, in fact. Opposing Palestinian rights is racism, not standing with Palestinians. So he could have done that. He chose for reasons that are quite puzzling, I think, not to. And that's why that's why he is where he is today, and that's a tragedy. But absolutely, if you stand up to a bully, they back off.
then the final question then. Sorry about that. And the final question I want to ask is this. It looks as if under the Netanyahu coalition government, they are going to fully annex the West Bank. Gaza has been under a terrible economic embargo since the Palestinians voted for Hamas in a democratic election. Whether you like Hamas or not is a whole other story. But since then, the Palestinians of Gaza have been punished brutally for that under very harsh sanctions. And now Israel is going to try to annex the West Bank. Are we going to, and Israel has been doing illegal settlements in the West Bank since the founding. Are we seeing the end of Palestine as we know it, unless COVID or no COVID, people get into the streets and protest against Israel and the governments that support Israel, which is the EU, France, Canada, the US, UK, New Zealand, Australia, and every other country I can think of under the belt?
Look, Israel, the entire Zionist project, the entire state of Israel is an illegal occupation. Every single city built, every single town built, every single village built by Israel is an illegal settlement going back almost 100 years. It's all a result of ethnic cleansing. It is facilitated through genocide and through an apartheid regime that's been in place since Israel was established. In other words, the very establishment of the state of Israel was the establishment of an apartheid regime by its own definition. By its own definition. They didn't use the word apartheid, but by its own definition of the kind of citizenship and land rights and so forth, they created an apartheid regime. So Palestine, as we know it, is a term that doesn't exist because Palestine is being destroyed every minute. Palestine, as we knew it 10 years ago, no longer exists. Palestine, as we know it today, is not going to exist next year. Things are moving very rapidly. The Israeli government has a minister for Jerusalem affairs who is part of the movement to build a new temple and destroy Al-Aqsa. That is the man who holds the Jerusalem portfolio in the Israeli government today. So we're going to be, a year from now, we might be having a conversation, after Al-Aqsa has been destroyed. That beautiful golden dome that's been part, the iconic image of Jerusalem will be gone. This is how fast things are happening, and this is what's coming up. If anybody has any doubt that this is the plan, they're out of their minds. Now, these groups that talked about, destroying Al-Aqsa and all this and building a temple, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they were fringe. They'd sneak into the temple, into the holy sanctuary and try to pray. Now they have tens and tens and tens of thousands every year. They lead these tours in order to create chaos, in order to to instigate. And they have a man who is their guy. He is the Minister of Jerusalem Affairs in the Israeli government. Their guy who absolutely believes that there should be a so-called Jewish temple instead of Al-Aqsa and instead of the Golden Dome. So yes, unless people get off their backsides and start fighting and join the Palestinian resistance and support BDS to the very, very, very end, to the very extreme definition of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, we're going to be talking a year from now, and Palestine, as we know it today, will have already been gone because the destruction is an ongoing process. People like to use the term status quo. There is no status quo. The other side is advancing rapidly, like a bulldozer, at full speed ahead. And that's what we're facing. So yes, absolutely. Unless people get out and start to fight and fight smart and organize, then there's not going to be a Palestine as we know it today tomorrow.
And that's also going to lead to a huge humanitarian crisis with the refugees who have to probably flee Israel, because it's going to be
there already is a massive humanitarian crisis, even among Palestinian citizens of Israel. The Negev in the southern part of Israel is called the Negev Desert. Massive humanitarian crisis there. And these are citizens of Israel with no access to water, electricity, Wi-Fi, medical care, or roads. And we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, not like 2 or 3. It's already taking place. So if we don't get our act together, if we don't get up soon and start fighting, then we're not even going to have the Palestine that we know today to fight for.
Alrighty. On that note, we were joined on this special edition of 1+1, All Things Israel by Miko Peled. Miko is a journalist who often writes for the really brilliant Mintpress News. He has his own YouTube channel. He does so many Zoom events with so many interesting people on the topic of Israel, and did a fantastic solidarity for Julian Assange with Roger Waters, John Pilger, and Ray McGovern. I'm going to make sure to link to all of that, Miko. And Miko, I definitely want to invite you back on again, because there's other issues in Israel that which I definitely want to pick your brain about, which you've written about. But we're going to do that another time. And I've not gotten your book yet, but people, if they go to MikoPeled.com, they can invite him to speak on these issues. And Miko wrote a very interesting book, which I really want to get, called The General's Son. And I'm also going to link to the interview that Paul J. of The Real News did with you, because it was a really interesting, moving interview where it gets into your background and how you've come to be an Israeli dissident. So on that note, Mr. Miko Peled, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to hopefully this being one of many conversations in the future.
Happy to do it. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Ciao, ciao, until then.
Bye-bye.